This week, there's going to be a meeting with IMF officials in Washington at the end of the week. IMF officials are set to tell finance ministers from across the globe that they need to focus more on housing. Sudeep, what specific advice do IMF officials plan to tell U.S. finance ministers?
Their big advice is to do something. We spent all these years waiting and watching a housing bubble deflate in the United States, in Spain. Now there's one that's starting to deflate in China. And the problem is they, in most cases, haven't done enough to deal with these problems. Government policymakers, for good reasons, don't want to take the politically very difficult decisions that will probably get them thrown out of office to go and bail out the housing sector. And that's really the core of the problems. We keep hearing, of course, and we will this week in Washington, about government deficits and all the problems hanging over governments, and they need to cut their budgets. They need to take these very difficult actions on the government front. But the reason many of these countries have these problems is because they haven't taken enough action on the housing front. In the United States, the economy is weak in large part because of the housing bust and what that's done by pushing up, first we pushed up household debt levels, and now we've got households constrained so that they can't spend. And the exact same thing is playing out in Spain right now.
And Sudeep, tell us a little bit about, first, with sticking with the U.S. I mean, interestingly enough, the IMF weighed in on this debate that's kind of going on between Republicans and Democrats, and in a way sided with Democrats in terms of saying, yeah, you know, Congress, you guys really need to provide some mortgage relief for homeowners. Well, how is that going to go over in Washington this week?
Exactly. This is a really politically treacherous debate for the IMF to wade into. But what they saw at the IMF is that it's too important. They actually put housing for the U.S. up there with the government deficit, with the budget deficit, as one of the two big problems that need to be addressed by the United States and by policymakers. So it's certainly going to rile up GOP lawmakers who really don't want the government stepping in even more in housing. We've all heard the endless debate about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and was the government subsidizing them too much going into the crisis? But we're obviously in a crisis now, and the government has largely taken control of these entities. And what the IMF is saying is that the U.S. should get Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to step in and do principal reduction, to lower the value of mortgages for people who are underwater, who owe more on their mortgage than their home is worth. And if you don't do something like that, then you're just going to end up with this endless trail of foreclosures and defaults, and it's just going to weigh down the economy for years and years. So it's a very difficult act, but it's one that the IMF saying really needs to be done.
Sudeep, just to be provocative here, isn't there at least a case to be made? I know it's certainly not definitive, but a case to be made that we're actually near the bottom in the U.S. in housing, that, you know, after 4 years and with some government help, but largely letting market forces work, that there's some evidence that in fact, we're near the bottom, at least in many of the local markets.
That's a great point, a great question, because if you look at housing in the United States, since the peak of the housing bubble in 2006, home prices have dropped on a nationwide basis about 34%. So we've gone through this tremendous run-up and pullback, and now we seem to be bouncing along the bottom in terms of home sales, in terms of home prices, and we're not seeing that much movement down or up, which could suggest that we've stabilized at a low level. The problem is not as entirely about housing now. It's about the fact that we now have a quarter of homeowners who have mortgages are underwater. They just can't, they're not going to see any hope on the horizon when they're sitting on mortgages this large after the housing bubble has popped like this.
Sudeep, we're going to have to cut in, sorry, and leave it there. But I mean, you know, talking about, people can find out more in your story, talking about their, you know, reaching maybe bottom here in the U.S. Where we definitely have not reached bottom, it sounds like from your story, is Spain. They expect housing prices to keep dropping there. But for more, turn you know, online to WSJ.com.